After finishing his coffee, Paul got back in the car and made his way to the highway again. In 45 minutes, he'd reached Moorhead City. He crossed over the bridge to Beaufort, followed the turns, then headed down east towards Cedar Island. There was a peaceful beauty to the coastal lowlands, and he slowed the car, taking it all in. Life, he knew, was different here. As he drove, he marveled at the people driving in the opposite direction who waved at him, and the group of older men sitting on a bench outside a gas station who seemed to have nothing better to do than watch the car pass by. In the mid-afternoon, he caught the ferry to Ocracoke, a village at the southern end of the Outer Banks. There were only 4 other cars on the ferry, and on the 2-hour ride he visited with a few of other passengers. He spent the night at a motel in Ocracoke, woke when the white ball of light rose over the water, had an early breakfast, and then spent the next few hours walking through the rustic village, watching people ready their homes for the storm brewing off the coast. When he was finally ready, he tossed the duffel bag into his car and began the trip northward to the place he had to go. The Outer Banks, he thought, were both strange and mystical, with sawgrass speckling the rolling dunes and maritime oaks bent sideways with a never-ending sea breeze. It was a place like no other. The islands had once been connected to the mainland, but after the last ice age, the sea had flooded the area to the immediate west, forming the Pamlico Sound. Until the 1950s, there wasn't a highway on the series of islands, and people had to drive along the beach to reach the homes beyond the dunes. Even now, it was part of the culture, and as he drove, he could see tire tracks near the water's edge. The sky had cleared in places, and though the clouds raced angrily toward the horizon, the sun sometimes squinted through, making the world glow fiercely white. Over the roar of the engine, he could hear the violence of the ocean. At this time of year, the Outer Banks were largely empty, and he had this stretch of roadway to himself. In the solitude, his thoughts returned to Martha. The divorce had become final only a few months earlier, amicable. He knew she was seeing someone, and he suspected she had been seeing him even before they had separated. But it wasn't important. These days, nothing seemed important. When she left, Paul remembered cutting back on his schedule, thinking he needed time to sort things out. But months later, instead of going back to his regular routine, he cut back even more. He still ran regularly, but found he no longer had any interest in reading the financial pages in the morning. For as long as he could remember, he'd needed only 6 hours of sleep at night. But strangely, the more he cut back on the pace of his previous life, the more hours he seemed to need to feel rested. There were other physical changes as well. For the first time in years, Paul felt the muscles in his shoulders relax. The lines in his face, grown deep over the years, were still prominent, but the intensity he once saw in his reflection had been replaced with a sort of weary melancholy. And though it was probably his imagination, it seemed as if his greying hair had finally stopped receding. At one time he had thought he had it all. He'd run and run, he'd reached the pinnacle of success. Yet now he realized he'd never taken his father's advice. All his life he'd been running away from something, not towards something, and in his heart he knew it had all been in vain. He was 54 and alone in the world, and as he stared at the vacant stretch of asphalt unfolding before him, he couldn't help but wonder why on earth he had run so hard. Knowing he was close now, Paul settled in for the final leg of his journey. He was staying at a small bed and breakfast just off the highway, and when he reached the outskirts of Rodanthe, he took in his surroundings. Downtown, if you could call it that, consisted of various businesses that seemed to offer just about everything. The general store sold hardware and fishing gear as well as groceries. The gas station sold tires and auto parts as well as the services of a mechanic. He had no reason to ask for directions, and a minute later he pulled off the highway onto a short gravel drive, thinking the inn at Rodanthe was more charming than he had imagined it would be. It was an aging white Victorian with black shutters and a welcoming front porch. On the railing were potted pansies in full bloom, and an American flag fluttered in the wind. He grabbed his gear and slung the bags over his shoulder, then walked up the steps and went inside. The floor was hard pine, scuffed by years of sandy feet, and without the formality of his former home, on his left there was a cozy sitting room, brightly lit by two large windows framing the fireplace. He could smell fresh coffee and saw that a small platter of cookies had been set out for his arrival. On the right, he assumed he'd find the proprietor, and he went that way. Though he saw a small desk where he was supposed to check in, no one was behind it. In the corner, he saw the room keys. The keychains were small statues of lighthouses. When he reached the desk, he rang the bell, requesting service. He waited, then rang again, and this time he heard what sounded like a muffled cry coming from somewhere in the rear of the house. Leaving his gear, he stepped around the desk and pushed through a set of swinging doors that led to the kitchen. On the counter were 3 unpacked grocery bags. The back door was open, beckoning him that way, and the porch creaked as he stepped outside. On the left, he saw a couple of rocking chairs and a small table between them. On the right, he saw the source of the noise. She was standing in the corner, overlooking the ocean. Like him, she was wearing faded jeans, but she was enveloped by a thick turtleneck sweater. Her light brown hair was pinned back, a few loose tendrils whipping in the wind. He watched as she turned, startled at the sound of his boots on the porch. Behind her, a dozen terns rode the updrafts, and a coffee cup was perched on the railing. Paul glanced away, then found his eyes drawn to her again. Even though she was crying, he could tell she was pretty. But there was something in the sad way she shifted her weight that let him know she didn't realize it, and that he would almost think, when looking back on this moment, had only served to make her even more appealing. Chapter 4. Amanda looked across the table at her mother. Adrian had paused and was staring out the window again. The rain had stopped. Beyond the glass, the sky was full of shadows. In the silence, Amanda could hear the refrigerator humming steadily. "Why are you telling me this, Mom?" "Because I think you need to hear it." "But why? I mean, who was he?" Instead of answering, Adrian reached for the bottle of wine. With deliberate motions, she opened it. After pouring herself a glass, she did the same for her daughter. "You might need this," she said. "Mom?" Adrian slid the glass across the table. "Do you remember when I went to Rodanthe, when Jean asked if I could watch the end?" It took a moment before it clicked. "Back when I was in high school, you mean?" "Yes." When Adrian began again, Amanda found herself reaching for her wine, wondering what this was all about. Chapter 5. Standing near the railing on the back porch of the inn on a gloomy Thursday afternoon, Adrian let the coffee cup warm her hands as she stared at the ocean, noting that it was rougher than it had been an hour earlier. The water had taken on the color of iron, like the hull of an old battleship, and she could see tiny white caps stretching to the horizon. Part of her wished she hadn't come. She was watching the end for a friend, and she'd hoped it would be a respite of sorts. But now it seemed like a mistake. First, the weather wasn't going to cooperate. All day, the radio had been warning of a big nor'easter heading this way. And she wasn't looking forward to the possibility of losing power or having to hole up inside for a couple of days. But more than that, despite the angry skies, the beach brought back memories of her too many family vacations, blissful days when she had been content with the world. For a long time, she'd considered herself lucky. She'd met Jack as a student. He was in his first year of law school. They were considered a perfect couple back then. He was tall and thin, with curly black hair. She was a blue-eyed brunette, a few sizes smaller than she was now. The wedding photo had been prominently displayed in the living room of their home, right above the fireplace. They had their first child when she was 28 and had 2 more in the next 3 years. She, like so many other women, had trouble losing all the weight she had gained, but she worked at it. And though she never approached what she had once been, compared to most of the women her age with children, she thought she was doing okay. And she was happy. She loved to cook. She kept the house clean. They went to church as a family, and she did her best to maintain an active social life for her and Jack. When the kids started going to school, she volunteered to help in their classes, attended PTA meetings, worked in their Sunday school, and was the first to volunteer when rides were needed for field trips. She sat through hours of piano recitals, school plays, baseball and football games. She taught each of the children to swim, and she laughed aloud at the expressions of their faces the first time they walked through the gates of Disney World. On her 40th birthday, Jack had thrown a surprise party for her at the country club, and nearly 200 people showed up. It was an evening filled with laughter and high spirits, but later, after they got home, she noticed that Jack didn't watch her as she undressed before getting into bed. Instead, he turned out the lights, and though she knew he couldn't fall asleep that quickly, he pretended he had. Looking back, she knew it should have tipped her off that all was not as it seemed, but with 3 children and a husband who left the child rearing up to her, she was too busy to ponder it. Besides, she neither accepted nor believed that the passion between them would never go through down periods. She'd been married long enough to know better. She assumed it would return as it always been, and she wasn't worried about it. But it didn't. By 41, she'd become concerned about their relationship and had started pursuing the self-help section of the bookstore, looking for titles that might advise her on how to improve their marriage, and she sometimes found herself looking forward to the future when things might slow down. She imagined what it would be like to be a grandmother, or what she and Jack might do when they had the time to enjoy each other's company as a couple again. Maybe then she thought things would go back to what they had once been. It was around that time that she saw Jack having lunch with Linda Gaston. Linda, she knew, worked with Jack's firm at their branch office in Greensboro. Though she specialized in estate law, while Jack worked in general litigation, Adrian knew their cases sometimes overlapped and required their collaboration. So it didn't surprise her to see them dining with each other. Adrian even smiled at them through the window. Though Linda wasn't a close friend, she'd been a guest in their home numerous times. They'd always gotten along well, despite the fact that Linda was 10 years younger and single. It was only when she went inside the restaurant that she noticed the tender way they were looking at each other, and she knew with certainty they were holding hands under the table. For a long moment, Adrian stood frozen in place. But instead of confronting them, she turned around and headed out before they had a chance to see her. In denial, she cooked Jack's favorite meal that night and mentioned nothing about what she had seen. She pretended it hadn't happened, and in time she was able to convince herself that she had been mistaken about what was going on between them. Maybe Linda was going through a hard time and he was comforting her. Jack was like that. Or maybe she thought it was a fleeting fantasy that neither of them had acted on, a romance of the mind and nothing else. But it wasn't. Their marriage began spiraling downward. Within a few months, Jack asked for a divorce. He was in love with Linda, he said. He hadn't meant for it to happen, and he hoped she would understand. She didn't, and said so. But when she was 42, Jack moved out. Now, over 3 years later, Jack had moved on, but Adrian found it impossible to do. Though they had joint custody, it was joint in name only. Jack lived in Greensboro, and the 3-hour drive was just long enough to keep the kids with her most of the time. Mostly she was thankful for that, but the pressure of raising them on her own tested her limits daily. At night, she often collapsed in bed, but found it impossible to sleep because she couldn't stop the questions that rolled through her mind. And though she never told anyone, she sometimes imagined what she would say if Jack showed up at the door and asked her to take him back, knowing that deep down she would probably say yes. She hated herself for that, but what could she do? She didn't want this life. She'd neither asked for it, nor expected it, nor she thought did she deserve it. She'd played by the book. She'd followed the rules. For 18 years, she'd been faithful. She'd overlooked those times when he drank too much. She brought him coffee when he had to work late, and she never said a word when he went golfing on the weekends instead of spending time with the kids. Was it just the sex that she was after? Sure. Linda, both younger and prettier. But was it really that important to him that he'd throw away everything else in his life? Didn't the kids mean anything? Didn't she? Didn't the 18 years together? And in any way, it wasn't as if she'd lost interest. In the last couple of years, whenever they'd made love, she'd been the one to initiate it. If the urge was so strong, why hadn't he done something about it? Or was it, she wondered, that he'd found her boring? Granted, because they had been married so long, there weren't a lot of new stories to tell. Over the years, most had been recycled in slightly different versions, and both had reached the point where they knew the endings in advance. After only a few words, instead, they did what she thought most couples did. She would ask how work had gone. She would ask about the kids. They'd talk about the latest antics of one family member or another, or what was happening around town. There were times that even she wished there were something more interesting to talk about. But didn't he understand that in a few years the same things was going to happen with Linda? It wasn't fair. Even her friends had said as much, and she assumed that meant they were on her side, and maybe they were, but they had a funny way of showing it. She thought a month ago she had gone to a Christmas party hosted by a couple she'd known for years, and who should happen to be there but Jack and Linda. It was a life in a small southern town. People forgave things like that, but Adrian couldn't help but feel betrayed. Beyond the hurt and betrayal, she was lonely. She hadn't been on a date since the day Jack had moved out. Rocky Mount wasn't exactly a hotbed of unmarried men in their 40s, and those who were single weren't necessarily the kind of men she wanted anyway. Most of them had baggage, and she didn't think she could tote around any more than she was already carrying. In the beginning, she told herself to be selective, and when she thought she was ready to enter the world of dating again, she mentally outlined a set of traits she was looking for. She wanted someone intelligent and kind and attractive. But more than that, she wanted someone who accepted the fact that she was raising 3 teenagers. It might be a problem, she suspected, but since her kids were pretty self-sufficient, she didn't think it was the type of hurdle that would discourage most men. Boy, was she ever wrong. In the last 3 years, she hadn't been asked out at all, and lately she'd come to believe that she never would. Good old Jack could have his fun. Good old Jack could read the morning paper with someone new, but for her, it just wasn't in the cards. And then, of course, there were the financial worries. Jack had given her the house and paid the court-ordered support on time, but it was just enough to make ends meet. Despite the fact that Jack earned a good living while they were married, they hadn't saved as they should have. Like so many couples, they'd spend years caught up in the endless cycle of spending most of what they'd earned. They had new cars and took nice vacations. When big screen television first hit the market, they were the first family in the neighborhood to have one in their home. She'd always believed that Jack was taking care of the future since he was the one who handled the bills. It turned out that he wasn't, and she'd had to take a part-time job at the local library. Though she wasn't so worried about her or the children, she was scared for her father. A year after the divorce, her father had had a stroke, then 3 more in rapid succession. Now he needed around-the-clock care. The nursing home she'd found for him was excellent, but as an only child, she bore the responsibility of paying for it. She had enough left over from the settlement to cover another year, but after that, she didn't know what she would do. She was already spending everything she earned at the part-time job she had taken at the library. When Jean had first asked if Adrian would mind watching the inn while she was out of town, she had suspected that Adrian was struggling financially and had left far more money than was necessary for the groceries. The note she'd left had told Adrian to keep the remainder as payment for her help. Adrian appreciated that, but charity from friends hurt her pride. Money, though, was only part of her worries about her father. She sometimes felt he was the only person who was always on her side, and she needed her father especially now. Spending time with him was an escape of sorts for her, and she dreaded the thought that their hours together might end because of something she did or didn't do. What would become of him? What would become of her? Adrian shook her head, forcing those questions away. She didn't want to think about any of this, especially now. Jean had said it would be slow. Only one reservation was in the books, and she had hoped that coming here would clear her mind. She wanted to walk the beach, read a couple of novels that had been sitting on her bedstand for months. She wanted to put her feet up and watch the porpoises playing in the waves. She'd hoped to find relief, but as she stood on the porch at the sea-worn inn at Rodanthe, awaiting the oncoming storm, she felt the world bearing down hard. She was middle-aged and alone, overworked and soft around the middle. Her kids were struggling. Her father was sick, and she wasn't sure how she would be able to keep going. That was when she started to cry, and minutes later, when she heard footsteps on the porch, she turned her head and saw Paul Flanner for the first time.